Something just snapped inside the American legal system, and the people in power know it. The Department of Justice just sent Virginia a warning letter over proposed gun restrictions, and if you think this is just another bureaucratic headline buried in the news cycle, you are missing the biggest shift in Second Amendment enforcement we've seen in decades, not years, decades. DOJ just sent Virginia a warning letter. Every anti-gun state should be terrified of what comes next, because for the first time in modern American history, the federal government is signaling that it may stop waiting for citizens to spend years fighting unconstitutional gun laws on their own. And if that happens, if this becomes the new standard minus, the entire political strategy behind aggressive state gun control starts collapsing overnight. Subscribe right now, because this story is moving fast. The legal consequences are enormous, and what happens next could affect every gun owner in America by the end of 2026. For years, states like New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, and Maryland have operated under the exact same playbook: pass the restriction, ignore constitutional concerns, force citizens into court, drag the case out for years, keep enforcing the law while ordinary Americans bleed money trying to defend rights they were supposed to already have. That has been the scam. And let's stop pretending it was anything else. State politicians knew many of these laws were constitutionally questionable the moment they signed them. They knew challenges were coming. They knew courts would eventually step in. But they also knew something else. The process itself was the punishment. A gun store owner loses customers immediately. A father who wants to protect his family suddenly faces new restrictions. Law-abiding citizens become accidental criminals overnight because lawmakers in expensive suits decided constitutional rights were optional depending on the zip code you live in. And then comes the legal nightmare. Find attorneys, file lawsuits, wait months for hearings, lose preliminary motions because lower courts stall appeal, wait again, spend more money, burn more time, watch judges dodge clear constitutional questions while politicians and stand at press conferences pretending they're keeping communities safe. Safe from who exactly? Because criminals don't care about magazine limits. Violent offenders don't not study state compliance paperwork. Gang members are not standing in line wondering whether their AR platform rifle violates subsection C, paragraph 4 of some state code. The burden always landed on ordinary Americans, and that burden was the point. The states counted on exhaustion. They counted on citizens giving up. They counted on people lacking the money or energy to fight government machinery for 5 straight years. That is how the game worked. Until now, because what the DOJ just did in Virginia changes the timing of the fight itself. That's the real story here. Virginia lawmakers proposed restrictions targeting commonly owned semi-automatic rifles, including AR-15 style firearms. Under the old system, those laws likely would have been signed first, enforced immediately, challenged later, and tied up in litigation until half the country forgot how the process even started. But this time the Department of Justice stepped in before the law even crossed the finish line. Read that again carefully. Before enforcement, before arrests, before years of litigation, before families and businesses absorbed the damage. The Civil Rights Division reportedly warned Virginia that if these restrictions become law, federal legal action could follow immediately, including lawsuits and injunctions aimed at stopping enforcement before citizens suffer constitutional harm. That is not routine government language. That is a shot across the bow. And if you're sitting in Sacramento, Albany, Trenton, or Chicago right now, drafting the next wave of gun restrictions, you're probably realizing something uncomfortable. The federal government may no longer be willing to sit back and watch states test constitutional boundaries unchecked. That changes everything. Because once the DOJ frames Second Amendment protections as civil rights enforcement priorities, the political landscape shifts dramatically. Think about the implications. For decades, federal civil rights enforcement has been treated as a proactive responsibility. Voting rights violations trigger federal intervention. Housing discrimination triggers federal intervention. Constitutional protections involving race, religion, or equal treatment trigger federal intervention. But gun rights, and those were often treated differently. Citizens were expected to fight alone. Not anymore. At least maybe not anymore. And that possibility alone is enough to terrify anti-gun states because it destroys the biggest weapon they had, war time. Time was always their advantage. Time drained resources, time discouraged lawsuits, time allowed unconstitutional laws to stay active long enough to reshape behavior. Time let politicians claim victory even when courts eventually overturned their laws years later. But immediate federal intervention changes the entire cost-benefit calculation. Now, legislators have to ask themselves a dangerous question. What if the lawsuit starts tomorrow instead of 5 years from now? What if federal injunctions freeze enforcement before the political optics even settle? What if the headlines stop being "State passes gun reform" and become "DOJ accuses state of violating constitutional rights"? That is a very different political environment, and states know it. This is why Virginia matters far beyond Virginia itself, because the constitutional framework already exists. The Supreme Court Heller in 2008 established that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. McDonald in 2010 applied that protection against state governments. Bruen in 2022 fundamentally changed the standard for evaluating gun restrictions by demanding historical tradition rooted in the founding era. And here's the critical part. Anti-gun states hate hearing firearms in common use by law-abiding citizens receive constitutional protection. That is devastating for modern assault weapon bans. Why? Because the AR-15 is not some fringe firearm owned by a tiny minority of Americans. Estimates place civilian ownership somewhere between 20 and 25 million rifles nationwide. That is common use by any objective standard imaginable, which means every state trying to ban or heavily restrict those firearms is now fighting uphill against clear Supreme Court language. And the DOJ warning to Virginia reportedly leaned directly into that argument. That matters enormously because the federal government is no longer speaking vaguely about policy concerns. It is speaking in constitutional terms: common use, protected arms, civil rights enforcement. That is legal language with teeth. Now bring this conversation to New Jersey, or California, or New York, or Illinois. These states already built entire legal frameworks around aggressive gun restrictions, assault weapon bans, magazine limits, carry restrictions, sensitive place expansion so broad they practically criminalize carrying everywhere. Many of those laws are already under active legal challenge, and some are losing. Courts have already issued injunctions against portions of state carry restrictions post-Bruen because the historical basis simply wasn't there. Judges looked at these laws and asked a basic constitutional question: where is the founding era equivalent? The states struggle to answer because there often isn't one. And now imagine those same states facing not just private lawsuits from citizens, but federal involvement from the DOJ Civil Rights Division itself. That escalates pressure instantly. Suddenly, this is not just gun activists versus the state. Now it becomes a constitutional enforcement issue backed by federal authority. That changes media coverage, that changes judicial urgency, that changes legislative calculations, and most importantly, it changes fear. Because politicians are comfortable fighting isolated citizens, they are less comfortable fighting the federal government publicly accusing them of constitutional violations. That is the shift happening right now. And let's be honest about why this conversation is exploding in 2026. Specifically, the country has changed. Americans are increasingly skeptical of institutions. Trust in government is collapsing. Trust in media is collapsing. Trust in federal agencies, state agencies, and political leadership is collapsing. People watched crime spikes. They watched riots. They watched prosecutors downgrade violent offenses while simultaneously demanding tighter restrictions on lawful gun ownership. And millions of Americans came to one conclusion: if the government cannot reliably protect me, then it does not get to disarm me either. That sentiment is not fringe anymore. It's mainstream, and politicians know it. That's why this DOJ intervention hit so hard politically. It signals that at least some elements within federal power structures recognize the constitutional vulnerability of these restrictions. Now, let's be clear. This does not guarantee victory for gun owners tomorrow morning. Courts still decide cases. Litigation still takes time. Some judges will resist. Some circuits will continue slow-walking challenges. Some states will pass laws anyway because political ideology outweighs legal caution. But signals matter, and this signal is massive. The federal government is effectively warning states that Second Amendment rights may now receive proactive constitutional enforcement rather than delayed reactive litigation. That is a historic shift. Subscribe right now if you're following these legal battles, because the next 12 months could reshape gun law in America faster than anything we've seen since Bruen. Here's another reality nobody wants to say out loud. Anti-gun lawmakers became addicted to governing through symbolism. They passed laws designed for headlines rather than constitutional durability. Why? Because there was rarely immediate accountability. If a law got overturned 6 years later, the politician who passed it already moved on to another office, another campaign, another fundraising cycle, and the damage was already done. But immediate federal intervention destroys that insulation. And now the backlash becomes immediate too, when now lawmakers risk national headlines accusing them of violating constitutional rights before the ink even dries. That changes marginal votes inside legislatures. And marginal votes are everything. Not every politician is a true ideological crusader. Some simply follow political momentum. Some support laws because they assume the legal consequences are distant and abstract. But once those consequences become immediate and public, some votes disappear. That's how legal climates change. And if you think this only affects gun policy, think bigger. This is about whether constitutional rights exist equally in every state, or whether states can effectively nullify rights temporarily through procedural delay. That question matters far beyond firearms, because rights delayed are rights denied. And Americans are increasingly tired of being told constitutional protections only matter after years of litigation. And the founders did not write the Bill of Rights as a suggestion booklet. They wrote limits on government power. That distinction matters. Now let's talk about the courts, because this next phase is going to be brutal. States are going to argue public safety. They always do. But Bruen shifted the legal battlefield away from generalized balancing tests and toward historical tradition. That means states must prove comparable restrictions existed during the founding era. And that is where many modern gun laws start collapsing under scrutiny. There were no AR-15s in 1791. Everyone understands that. But there were also no television broadcasts, smartphones, or the internet. Constitutional protections still apply to modern equivalents. The key legal question is whether the firearm is commonly owned for lawful purposes. The AR-15 clearly is, and that is why the common use doctrine matters so much. And it is why anti-gun states keep finding themselves cornered legally. They want, of course, to focus on aesthetics, emotion, and political fear. The constitutional framework demands historical analysis. Instead, those are two completely different conversations. Now layer federal DOJ involvement on top of that framework. Federal lawsuits carry institutional weight. Judges treat them differently. Injunction requests backed by the federal government land differently than private citizen lawsuits struggling for resources, and states know it. That's why the Virginia warning letter sent shockwaves through legal circles. And because even the possibility of proactive DOJ enforcement changes the battlefield before the first case is even filed. And here's the part ordinary Americans need to understand clearly. This fight is not ending anytime soon. If anything, it's escalating. States will continue testing boundaries. Courts will continue refining standards. Political pressure will intensify from both directions. But the trajectory shifted. That's the headline nobody can ignore. For the first time in years, anti-gun states may be losing control of the timeline itself. And once governments lose control of timing, they often lose control of outcomes too. Because speed matters in constitutional conflicts. Every month a restriction stays active affects real lives. Every delayed ruling affects businesses, families, and citizens trying to navigate conflicting laws while politicians posture for cameras. That's why the DOJ intervention matters beyond politics. It potentially compresses the timeline, and compressed timelines mean unconstitutional laws face resistance faster. That is exactly what anti-gun states fear most. They fear immediate scrutiny. They fear fast injunctions. They fear national attention. And above all, they fear losing the ability to quietly normalize restrictions while courts crawl through years of procedure. That era may be ending, The next year is going to tell us whether this Virginia intervention was symbolic or transformational. Was it a one-time warning? Or was it the opening move in a broader federal strategy treating Second Amendment protections as enforceable civil rights nationwide? Because it's the second option, then every restrictive gun state in America just entered a completely different legal era. And honestly, they know it. That's why this story matters so much. Not because one letter magically changes every law overnight, but because systems change when incentives change. And the incentive structure around aggressive gun restrictions may have just fundamentally shifted. So watch Virginia carefully, watch New Jersey carefully, watch California, New York, Illinois, and Maryland carefully. Because what happens next could redefine the balance between federal constitutional enforcement and state gun regulation for the next generation. And if you think the political establishment is comfortable with that fight, you haven't been paying attention. The pressure is building from every direction now. The courts, the states, the federal government, the voters. The legal system is heading toward collision points that cannot be avoided much longer. And somewhere in that collision is the future of the Second Amendment in America. Subscribe now, because this fight is accelerating, and the people trying to reshape constitutional rights are counting on Americans not paying attention long enough to notice what's changing. Stay informed, stay alert. And remember something the political class keeps forgetting. Constitutional rights are not temporary privileges handed out by whichever party happens to hold power this election cycle. They are supposed to survive politics itself. That's the test America's walking into right now. And Virginia may end up being the moment history looks back on as the beginning of an entirely new phase in the Second Amendment battle.